First turn kills have been really prevalent throughout the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! And these often involve the abuse of a singular card or game mechanic that was not intended at all to be used a certain way. This is probably one of the most unique FTK decks that actually did well in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! This is a story about how one card enabled an FTK so powerful that Konami actually had to ban the titular card involved in the deck. Empty Jar! As the name would imply, this is a deck that revolved around the usage of Morphing Jar to actually deck out your opponent.
Hassan shot! It was a Morphing Jar.
Morphing Jar is a monster that has a flip effect where both players discard their hands and draw 5 cards from their deck. This was a card released in Tournament Pack Season 2 way back in the day, over 20 years ago. Obviously, early Yu-Gi-Oh cards didn't have once per turn restrictions, and players actually realized early on that this could be used in a mill-heavy deck with cards like Needleworm that also milled 5 cards from the top of your opponent's deck. And once your opponent's deck hit 0 and they tried to draw for draw phase, that means they lost the duel. R&D quickly realized that Morphing Jar was actually a force to be reckoned with, and they quickly restricted it to 1 copy per deck on the ban list. But it wasn't until the release of the book cards that a first turn kill was actually viable, and thus the deck Empty Jar was born. How does this work, you might ask? All you have to do is set Morphing Jar, then activate Book of Taiyu, which changes the defense mode monster to attack position, therefore flipping the Morphing Jar on your turn, triggering its effect. You could then chain the effect of Book of Moon or Book of Eclipse to flip back that Morphing Jar face down, and then draw a fresh hand, hoping to hit another Book of Taiyu and rinsing repeating the entire combo. And in the process, you deck out your opponent because they'd be drawing 5 new cards each time. Only the difference is because you're the user of Morphing Jar, you can actually choose which cards to set to your side of the field so that they're not discarded by Morphing Jar. But Morphing Jar discards the hands of both players and you're both forced to draw 5 cards. So how would you ensure that your opponent decks out before you do? Well, it's simple really. The existence of another card that was a staple in the deck called Card Destruction. If you guys had the original starter deck Yugi, then you'll probably remember this card that forces both players to discard their hands and draw an equal amount of cards that they had in their hand. And because you were able to set cards to your side of the table, so you had a smaller hand, at some point when you actually drew the card destruction, you would set it to your table, then set the remainder of the cards in your hand, activate card destruction, so your opponent is forced to discard and draw the remainder of their deck, while you would draw little to no cards because you would leave no cards in your hand and the rest of the cards safely intact in your deck. This was first a deck around 2005 during Go Control format where you could actually play 2 jars, Morphing Jar as well as Cyber Jar, another monster that allowed you to thin your opponent's deck by flipping over the top 5 cards and special summoning any level 4 or lower monsters to that field. You would also play cards like Spell Reproduction to discard 2 spell cards from your hand to the graveyard to add back any spell card in your graveyard, so you can recycle both of the books. Cards like a Feather the Phoenix also allowed you to top deck a card in your graveyard and then draw it once you flipped over the Morphing Jar so you could rinse and repeat and continue comboing off. Talograve also allowed you to resurrect the Morphing Jar or the Cyber Jar if anything was destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, and recruiters like Mystic Tomato allowed you to actually special summon out the Cyber Jar. You would also play cards like Upstart Goblin to thin your deck and draw into more cards, obviously. Now this deck was more of a memey rogue deck that didn't really do well in competitions until 6 years later when we actually got the tools that we needed for this deck to be viable enough to get 3rd place at a YCS of over 1,000 players. Fast forward 6 years to 2011, YCS Charlotte, where Paul Cooper, aka Paul Empty Jar Cooper, actually managed to get 3rd place out of over 1,000 players. Empty Jar was especially powerful because of the release of 2 new cards that allowed the deck to flourish even further. Book of Eclipse was basically a Book of Moon that did the exact same thing and allowed you to flip your jar face down, so that was 3 more copies of Book of Moon, but also the release of AD Changer, a monster that says you can banish this card from your graveyard to change the battle position of a monster on the field, and when you discarded this off of Morphing Jar during the process of resolving its effect, it meant that you had another Book of Taiyu access in your graveyard. By banishing AD Changer from your graveyard, you could change the position of your Morphing Jar back to attack mode. So now the deck effectively had 6 copies of Book of Taiyu and 6 copies of Book of Moon. Gold Sarcophagus was also a card widely released to players through Gold Series and was at 3 copies, allowing you to search for Morphing Jar after stalling your opponent out for 2 turns, which is pretty easy with cards like Swift Scarecrow that skipped your opponent's battle phase for the turn. Magical Stone Excavation and a Feather Phoenix were still played at this time, so you could recycle your combo cards. Card destruction is also a very key component of the deck and how it worked. Now, card destruction actually had a ruling change between the OCG and the TCG. In the OCG at the time, you were not legally allowed to activate card destruction if your opponent had less cards in their deck than their hand. But in the TCG, you could actually activate it, forcing your opponent to draw a number equivalent to the cards in their hand, and because they had more cards in their hand, they would lose the duel because they'd be drawing while they had no cards left in their deck. He also played Deep Diver, a monster that would allow you to search for any monster in your deck and place it on top of the deck at the end of the battle phase, aka searching for your Morphing Jar and more copies of Sangan, more or less. The existence of Pot of Duality was also extremely meta-breaking, and in Empty Jar it was no different because you could search your deck for any combo piece or potentially Jar itself. Magical Mallet also allowed you to fix your hand at any point. If you stumbled upon a brick, you could just shuffle back cards in your hand and then reset so you could see more combo pieces to continue milling your opponent. He lost to a crucial misplay in the top 4, unfortunately special summoning Volcanic Queen to his opponent's side of the field, Sean Kubert, who actually ended up winning the YCS, and Sean picked up the card and realized that he could actually apply the effect where he could burn Paul for 1,000 points of direct damage and win that duel. In game 3, despite having Jar on his opening turn, he unfortunately had a very awkward hand where he could not get enough gas to continue flipping his Morphing Jar face down. However, fun thing to note is that in the 3rd and 4th place playoffs, Paul actually won against Billy Break and his X-Saber deck, which is really crazy. This was a 2-0 victory to boot. His deck had a heavy side deck for the metagame. Now, 6 Samurais were running around rampant, and legendary 6 Samurai Xian as well as Naturia Beast both negated spell cards, which was probably the worst matchup for this deck. Though it makes a lot of sense why he decided to side of 3 copies of Volcanic Queen and Lava Golem to deal with these issues, which also meant you couldn't really play around Lava Golem by just summoning 1 monster instead of 2. He also played Prohibition, which is a good card to call anything that might hurt the deck, as well as Royal Decree for the trap heavy decks that were out there at the time. Now, Book of Moon and Book of Eclipse were especially important against this deck because at the time, Effect Veiler was one of the major hand traps and one of the only hand traps that were legal at the time, which you could dodge directly by chaining Book of Moon or Book of Eclipse to Effect Veiler and then making sure that your Morphing Jar resolved. After this tournament, players actually started siding Necromanic King just for the deck itself, because when Necromanic King was discarded by your opponent, their turn immediately ends. So that definitely hampered the deck, and because people were more prepared for it, it never really made another showing until a year later. Also, guys, if you like content like this, I do have a Patreon. There's a link below in the description. I'm also uploading a lot of competitive content like masterclasses. We have a new Tenpai masterclass on the Patreon, and it just goes through a lot of the stuff in the deck. We go through a lot of the tech choices and the different starter plays that you can do. You also get early access to all the new videos. We talk about cool tech cards and choices that people are playing, and just a lot of cool stuff about Yu-Gi-Oh! In general. Patreon is in the link below. Definitely go check that out. In 2012 at YCS Atlanta, Kevin Petriella was actually able to make a top 16 finish with Empty Jar, now with some upgraded toys.
So how does it feel to be Paul Empty Jar Cooper's successor?
People call me the white Paul Cooper.
Tour Guide from the Underworld was officially released, and this allowed you to special summon out Sangan, so that just meant additional ways to get the Morphing Jar and maximum consistency, so you didn't have to play cards like Deep Diver that required a destruction by battle and were easily stopped by a lot of things in the format like Evolve Sardoka, for example. You no longer had to play hideous cards like Dark World Dealings that were inherent neg 1s, but the thing that made the deck especially terrifying was the existence of this new card, One Day Apiece, which says both player draws a card and then neither player takes any damage until the end of the next turn, which effectively bought you a turn as well as drawing a card. So it was Upstart Goblin plus Swift Scarecrow rolled into one thing. And that card was crazy. They eventually had to limit this card because it was heavily abused in strategies like this, as well as Chain Burn. Now, the deck obviously required the surprise factor, and no one was really siding cards like Necromanic King anymore because the deck fell off, inadvertently allowing the deck to come back with a vengeance. But after the second YCS top, people were expecting the deck and were prepared for it, so it didn't see a lot of tops later on. And a couple of years later, Morphing Jar was banned on the Forbidden Limited list alongside his brother Morphing Jar number 2, presumably because someone at Konami just hated mill decks. And so came to an end to one of the most unique FTK decks in the history of the game. But you know, I thought I'd share this with you guys to get your thoughts on a deck like this. I mean, you literally can't play, you just watch your opponent play the whole time, but it's really a creative and unique deck, I think, and it just happened to work with the card pool that Konami gave us. But yeah, what do you guys think about content like this? Let me know in the comments below. Other than that, I'll see you guys next video. Thanks a lot for tuning in.